Hello, and welcome to episode 24 of the Detours in Music podcast. My name is Laura Rupel, and today we have an interview with James Madison University Assistant Professor of Voice, Jamison Walker. I hope you enjoy.
I'm Dr. Jamison Walker, and I'm a professor of voice at James Madison University.
Perfect. Can you talk about your start in music?
Sure. I began, I started singing, according to my family rumors, at the age of 2. I sang Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Jingle Balls at church, at the First Wayne Street Church in Peru, Indiana. My grandmother was a tremendously talented musician. She was one of those people who could hear something once and then play it in any key on the piano with any accompaniment that you needed, and was a wonderful, I would say, probably 1950s era, like lower voice female role. She really liked some of the early gospel music and stuff that was done, and so she sang. My uncle also is a singer and a recorder, a recording artist. He did a lot of mixing and mastering for groups like Steely Dan in LA when he was out there, but he was really a wonderful singer and also a very talented pianist. So for as long as I can remember, I've been singing something.
Mm-hmm.
It was pretty fun. I've never not had music in my life.
Yeah. Did you ever do like an orchestral instrument or a band instrument?
Well, we grew up in our household. We were really quite poor. It was a single family income, and so anytime I needed to do something, it was difficult for my parents to afford lessons and things like that. I took some piano lessons, but I had inherited a pretty good ear. So I would have the teacher, not knowing that I was cheating, I would have them play it for me once, and I'd watch and listen, and then I would be able to play it again without actually having to look at the double bars of the piano score.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, that was what I tried to take, but I didn't get very far in the lessons, and affording an orchestral instrument was just not within our parents' abilities.
Yeah, I'm always just curious with vocalists sometimes if they've, like, I guess, physically played.
I wish, because I love the oboe.
Okay.
I really do. I had an oboe friend, actually he was my roommate for the first couple of years in college, and he was an oboist, really quite wonderful. Worked with John Delancey a good bit, if you know that name.
Yeah.
And he was just fantastic. And so I was fully versed in all the Telemann and all of the really great oboe literature that he would listen to. So it was really, but if I could play one, that's what I would want to play.
Interesting. Can you talk about when you thought of actually pursuing voice or pursuing music?
Sure. I'll back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
I always sang, my grandmother would tour around different churches and do programs, right? Those were a big thing in the 70s and 80s. And so I would go and I would sing a couple of solos. But when I got into middle school, I was in choir, but it was just it wasn't a choir where we actually performed. It's like some days we would sing, some days we'd beat on a xylophone, some days we didn't do anything other than watch something musical, right? So there wasn't a whole lot of engagement in our middle school program. Mr. Reel, the musician who was in charge of that, was really a great guy. He just didn't have a lot of support from the administration to make a good music program. But Elena Fitzgerald, who was my high school choir teacher, she saw me in one of my grandmother's programs and encouraged me to take choir in high school. And I didn't want to take choir because choir was for girls. And I was, typical dumb young guy. I didn't know anything. But so I went into choir and I looked around and there were all these great ladies in there and like 5 guys. And at first I was like, oh man, but then I was like, hey, this isn't so bad, right? So I would sing in the choir and do some solo work and stuff like that. Usually we would do 2 programs a year and I would sing something as a solo. But I fell in love with music theater and I wanted to pursue music theater pretty hardcore. And by the time I got to my senior year in high school, I decided that was what I was going to do. I was going to be a musical theater singer. And the crazy thing was all of my friends that had graduated a year or 2 years earlier that went to musical theater schools came back and their voices were a mess. They were not getting very good training, and it was raspy, and it just sounded to me like a lot more wear and tear had been done on their cords than actual good. And so, as happenstance was, Pavarotti in Hyde Park was playing on PBS. And so I watched it, and I was like, hey, that old guy, he's probably close to the age I am now, right? And I'm like, that old guy, he sings pretty well, and he's singing a whole bunch of stuff. So maybe I'll learn a couple of classical songs and audition for classical music schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so I learned, for people who know anything about operatic repertoire, I was 16 years old. I learned Vesti la Giuba and La Donna Immobile to sing for musical theater auditions. I'm 44 years old now, and the last couple of years I've started looking at Vesti la Giuba, right? I've sung the opera a few times, so I had no idea. And every place that I auditioned was like, wow, great voice. Who picked your rep? And I said, I did. I picked it because I heard it on the Three Tenors concert.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, gotcha. Well, you should probably put that away for a few years. But I ended up not knowing anything about what accreditation meant, what higher education was all about. I just knew I wanted to learn how to sing well.
Mm-hmm.
I got accepted to the New World School of the Arts Opera Conservatory in Miami, Florida, which, as it turns out, was accredited through Miami-Dade Community College for the associate's degree. And at the time that I went in, Florida International University for the bachelor's degree.
Okay.
So I went there. I didn't know if an institution wasn't solely accredited, that you couldn't transfer credits or anything like that. Well, in the middle of my junior year there, they switched from Florida International University to the University of Florida. And they were having a real difficult time trying to find how they were going to allow for instance, we had 2 semesters of music history, whereas UF wanted to have 4 semesters of music history. We had 2 semesters of theory, University of Florida wanted 4. So we're trying to figure out, with those of us who had passed a certain point, how they were going to make the 2 systems merge together. And so in the middle of my senior year, they still hadn't figured this out. I took 1 extra semester of stuff that I just wanted to take, and orchestral conducting and voice lessons, of course. I sang in the opera. I took some music history classes and an opera history class. And after that, I had met my wife. We had gotten married, and I'm like, I don't know how much longer I can wait around in Miami for this school to get themselves together. So with 132 credits and no degree, I left and started looking at ways to make money and to sing.
Okay. That seems like a bold move.
Well, I didn't know what else to do, there weren't set up in my life the kind of support systems that a lot of students have now. Like now, when I work with my students, I try to prepare them for the things that are coming. There wasn't any of that. My parents, I'm the first person to go to college and to get a degree of any sort outside of high school. And so it was just not something that they knew how to tell me to do. They weren't necessarily against me getting an education, but they surely did think that going to school and doing all of that was not nearly as important as perhaps going and getting a job and figuring out life.
Yeah.
But yeah, and even in the university, there were very few people who were there who could say, hey, this is what you should do. You should look at this, for a master's degree one day, or if there wasn't anything like that.
Yeah, that does make sense, I guess. I'm sorry that the school was at that point.
Well, they were doing the best they could, they were seeking out accreditation. It wasn't, I don't blame them at all, right? It just happened to be that was the direction that my life took. And because of that, going off, it actually comes into play later, so actually being kind of a good thing.
Yeah.
But I left and I sang with some very small regional companies. I sang some opera stuff, and I would, do your Messiahs and your Bach Magnificats and the things that are done a lot for singers at the regional level. And I really worked on, to the best of my ability, trying to figure out how to have an operatic career. But then my wife and I had our first child, And I thought, insurance is a great thing. And so I entered into the Army for the first time,
Okay.
and I became a counterintelligence agent in the Army. It was really, I had never done anything like that before in my life, of course, but it was really very strange to suddenly be from the free-spirited world of academia and the arts within academia to boot. Suddenly, then I find myself in the Army, where they tell you what you wear, when you wear it, and what you're going to do, and it's a bunch of hurry up and wait. But it was really, I enjoyed my Army time. I got to do some things that a lot of folks would never get to do. After I was almost finished with my advanced individual training for counterintelligence, they said, "Who wants to take a test?" And I'm like, well, I can take a test, or I can pick up leaves or turn over rocks or do something like that. So I'm like, I'll go take a test. And they took me in and showed me this booklet that had a fake language in it. And because I had done a little bit of diction and some foreign language, I recognized that there were masculine, feminine, and neuter endings to most of these. So they would give you a made-up language like blah 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 blah, and the E would often be associated with more than one person in the frame of the picture, right? And you had to pick the best made-up language for the picture that was there. So I passed it, and I was sent to California to learn Arabic.
Wow.
And when I was done with Arabic, they asked, "You've got some time. Would you like to take up another language?" And I was thinking about my music career, and I said, "Yeah, I'd like to take up some Russian and learn how to pronounce the Cyrillic." So I got the opportunity to do those things within the capacity of being a counterintelligence agent in the U.S. Army.
Wow, I was not expecting you to say that at all.
Yeah, it was totally crazy, right?
Yeah.
So then after that, in 2000, I decided, well, I think that the Army, I've had enough of that. I wanted to really have a chance to, I wasn't interested in being deployed for long periods of time. And the weight of what it is that I had to do in my job was not something that I wanted to endure on my soul for an awful long time. So I thought, well, I think what I'll do is I'll go ahead and get out, finish my tour, and then I'll go about auditioning and start some businesses and try to find a good job and see what I can do to build something up to create the funds necessary to be able to go and audition. A lot of people within music don't think about auditions, but for singers, there are a lot of singers who need upwards of 5 figures to afford the auditions and the plane fare and the hotel lodgings and stuff like that, just to get through a year's worth of auditions with the hope that something happens that at least pays a portion of that back. And that's sometimes a 5 or 6 year time period where, and since we don't have, people that are funding a lot of singers nowadays, it's really pretty expensive for singers to do it. I thought, well, I can at least, find a good job. So I did a couple of odd things, and, I dug ditches for the building of a hospital, but as soon as I first got out, and that was miserable. But then they needed an accountant and to keep track of the job site purchases. So they're like, well, why don't you come do this? And that was a little more tolerable, but I learned a lot of patience doing that. And then I was invited to manage a lawn care company, and I ended up taking over all of that and rearranging routes and making it more efficient and building it up, and things were going pretty good. But it was kind of tough to find enough time to prepare myself and the people to help me prepare for opera. So I didn't ever stick it aside. I still would do concerts. I still would do stuff like that. But my main jobs then became building these other businesses. And I was very lucky. I got offered a position with a young man that I had known from a church I used to attend a long time ago. And he and I, from 2 guys we were in, his parents owned a construction company. And so we would do the trim packages, which is basically the doors and the thresholds and the baseboards and sometimes crown molding, that we would paint those things for them. And we would do 1 or 2 of those a week. But by the end of a year, we were doing about 150 to 200 whole houses a year. And by the end of the next year, we were upwards of closer to 400 whole houses a year, and had a couple of teams and really built that up. And I learned my first real business lesson, and that was that you have to get everything in writing, especially when you're dealing with friends.
Yeah.
And so once the business got big, his parents decided that they were going to remove me from partial owner of the company and allow me to be a paid employee. And I wasn't going to have that. So, I thought about different things that I could do, and I had gotten my real estate license, and I was selling real estate like crazy. So I just politely bowed out of that business. I wasn't purchased out, but I had to bow out of it. And I learned, from the future, even if there are people that I know and I care about, I'm going to go ahead and get everything in writing. And I was selling real estate, and I decided to go back and get my master's at Stetson University. And at Stetson University, that's the first time that I had real mentorship. Jane Christensen, who is on faculty still there actually, was the first person who really said, these are the things you need to think about for auditions. I didn't know what a vocal fach was. I didn't know any of that stuff, right? And she really helped me kind of ground in that area. So I finished my bachelor's degree there. So those 132 credits that were just hanging out.
Yeah.
I got a call from Duncan Couch, who was the choir director there, and he said, "I'm getting ready to retire, and you're too talented not to have a degree. So I would like to invite you to apply, and we will make it as cost effective." They made it very affordable for me to attend as we can. So I applied late and got accepted and got a fantastic scholarship offer and went through and graduated cum laude. And at that time I had 2 children. I've been married. I was commuting an hour back and forth for school and trying to make all of this work. And then when that was done, I went right to Florida State University and finished my master's degree, or started and finished my master's degree. So when I was looking then at what to do, I wasn't sure if I needed to go and get the doctorate. It's not that I didn't have a plan. I just didn't know quite what needed to be next.
Yeah.
So I went back into the Army and took care of a little bit of student loan debt. And I sang for the U.S. Army Band at Fort Gordon, Georgia. My official title was the Signal Center of Excellence soloist, whatever that means, right? But basically, I sang a whole bunch of national anthems, a whole bunch of Army songs, and married and buried, and saw people off into retirement and welcomed to new leadership. And every time somebody would come in that was of international renown, I would sing something somewhere for them. But when I did that, I was able to sing with the rock band. I was able to sing with the big band. I was able to sing with the acoustic band, which did a lot of pop stuff, but with acoustic instruments. And I sang with the concert band, so your regular formal stuff. And it was there that I met probably one of my best buddies, Jim Betancourt, who is now over at the Shape Band for the United Nations, but or the European Union. I can't remember what Shape is, but I think he's in Brussels. But he was a fantastic mentor for me and kind of taught me about the business end of getting the business end of music down. And then when that was done, I did one tour there. When that was finished, I reapplied at Florida State University for my doctoral degree and got it and finished that in 2 years.
Wow.
And then started on faculty at Stetson University. I was there for 3 years before being offered a sweet gig in China where I got to head up the music portion, or the arts portion in general, but the music portion in particular of a school in China, and then came to James Madison University. So that is a very truncated Reader's Digest version of my assimilation through. What
That's
questions
incredible.
do you have about that?
I guess for you, was being a musician your motivator through all of those like odd jobs or stuff, I guess?
Yes, absolutely. I can't imagine not having music in my life. But there was always a plan. I've always wanted to better myself and better. I think all musicians to a degree are self-conscious about what it is that they do, right? I remember reading or maybe it was watching a Pavarotti video, and he talked about being scared all the time, always being nervous that he's not going to be enough or he's not going to be good enough. And I lived with that for a long time, and working those other jobs in order to afford a voice lesson here, or being able to enter a competition here. I wasn't able to do a lot. And there were a lot of negative experiences. There were a lot of experiences that were harrowing and disappointing, but there were also a lot of things that were monumental in helping me become the fellow that I am today. And most of those things that were monumental were the after effects of things that I thought would go one way that went very differently for me. But music was always the motivator. It was always the I'm going to do this now, this awful hard thing, so that I can afford to do this other thing that I love to do later.
Yeah. Did you ever consider not going back to doing music?
I did. When I was selling real estate, I was really good at it. But and there are things about being a musician. There are things about being a singer, actually, that I'll say that are tough. My instrument is me, right? So if I play oboe and I get an upper respiratory infection, as long as I can create the armature, whatever, the noise, as long as I can make the noise, or same thing with trumpet, doesn't mean that it's going to be comfortable, but I can always make that. If I'm a pianist, then I can probably put my hands down. As long as I'm not like physically dizzy or unable to sit, I can probably get through what it is I need to do. But as a singer, when I'm angry, the voice reacts differently. When I'm happy, or when I'm sad, or when I'm feeling vulnerable, or when the temperature shifts from summer to fall or winter. Winter's actually one of the better times because there isn't any pollen. But when the trees decide that they're going to be beautiful and pollinate everything, or the grass, all of those things affect the actual instrument. And fatigue does too. I know that instrumentalists' lips and mouths and hands and arms and stuff get tired as well, but it's different for the vocal folds because they just won't function. And where you may feel fantastic at 5:30, when you start that 8 o'clock recital, if something has happened in between 5:30 and 8, you're in trouble. And there's not a lot you can do to fake the funk with it, right?
Yeah.
So I've thought to myself what it would be like to not worry about those two little muscles, two little flaps of skin that sit in my throat, right? And there were things that I thought about doing. I thought that I would make a great lawyer, or that I would make a really great doctor. There are lots of things that I think I would excel at, but I can't imagine not doing music.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine it. I think that even if I were, delivering babies, or, defending people or whatever, or prosecuting folks, I would imagine that even though that would be my primary means of income, it would just be what I did to afford my music habit.
Yeah. Do you think that when your sole career goal isn't music, that it kind of takes that pressure off of like not being enough, as you're saying?
Probably. The whole not being enough is a massive topic, and I think it has to do more with society. I mean, we think about ourselves as not being enough, and I can honestly say, especially for people who may listen to this, that think to themselves that they're on their aspirations are to become this. Don't wait. I waited for way too many things. I waited until I thought I was good enough. I waited until that high note was this way, or I waited until my coloratura was clean enough. I was always waiting. And as a result, I missed out on a lot of really great opportunities that would have presented themselves earlier, just because I didn't think that I was enough, rather than recognizing how great I was in that moment, and recognizing that there's always room for improvement, and just moving forward. I allowed the fear of not being enough to hold me back. And I would imagine for somebody who perceives this as an amateur, and I mean that in the sense of one who loves something, so they make it an avocation instead of a vocation, right? But I would imagine an amateur who just loves to sing, being able to open up their mouth and make noises. And if the noises don't sound great today, whatever, I'm a lawyer. This is good enough for me, right? As opposed to the way that we as singers do, where we listen to every single thing and we try to find, how can I make this perfect? How can I make this real? When in actuality, I think that audiences are much less concerned with that. I don't think that we attend live theater. I don't think that we attend live concerts and orchestral concerts because we want to hear pretty music.
Yeah.
I think that we go because we want to feel.
Mm.
And for me and for my students and for the people that come within my sphere of influence, I try to inculcate the idea that our job isn't to create something necessarily that is beautiful. Our job is a contractual obligation for the price of a ticket, or even probably more importantly, the price of someone's time, where we promise them we're going to give them an experience that is different from their everyday life. And they sacrifice, right? I mean, if you've got an 8 o'clock concert in Harrisonburg, Virginia, if you've got an 8 o'clock concert, you probably get off work at 5:30 or 6. You either have to go out and get a nice bite to eat or grab something quick and then get into the theater 15 minutes, 20 minutes earlier. And then you're there for an hour and a half listening to somebody. And honestly, it's a lot easier to sit on your couch and live stream the Met, knowing that you're going to get something that's really cool because you might have watched that production again, than it is to risk the precious time to go see something live. So our obligation is then to take them and help them transform whatever it is that they came to transform. Lots of people are sad. Lots of people are hurting. Lots of people are looking for happiness. And fortunately for singers, we have texts that go along with this great music, right? And so when we sing songs about love, we might be helping someone who's processing love. If we sing songs about loss, we're providing a safe sphere in which we can commune soul to soul with someone to help them deal with loss. And to me, taking them there, elevating them from the day in and day out, and then returning them safe at home, regardless of whether or not it was the best singing or the most beautiful tone or the most stentorian high notes, that's our job. That's our job. And by thinking in that singer way that I did, which is pretty much analytical, it's impossible for me to live in that creative healing space. So it's not to say that we don't do the technical. We have to learn to sing well, right? That's what the exercises are for, and that's what going through, that's why I practice. I don't ever let somebody see me practicing on stage during a performance, right? I've done all of my work ahead of time so that when I go in there, I can just be there. And I'm not thinking about, I need to close this a little bit more, open in the back, make sure that E vowel is right there at the base of the conjunction between the hard palate and the soft palate. I don't have to think about that crap. That's all done, right? So,
I think a lot of that will be heightened, I hope, when we're back in live performance. Because
I can't wait.
Exactly. It's like, if someone didn't think it was about making people feel things, I think we're all going to feel things for a while after that.
Yes. Well, I'm hoping, I know that this is a singular event in human history, right? I mean, it's not singular in the sense that this isn't the first pandemic we've had. It's probably not the last pandemic we're going to have. It's not the first time that we'll be asked as a community, a global community, to do hard things, right? And as much as we might think that staying home is so much easier than doing other things, it's really not, because as creatures that rely on the energy of and the interaction with and even physical contact with other humans, this is hard, right? I mean, as a creative person, I know I meet with my students each week and we have our lesson. And while some things are fantastic, like their voices, because they're not staying up late and laughing and giggling, or they're not singing in 4.5 hours of choir and another 4.5 hours of a cappella, plus what they do for the opera. Their voices are fresh. They sound great, right? But there is that missing of the energy that we have. And even though we can kind of capture it over the internet, it's not the same.
No.
It's just not the same.
What are some things that you struggled with in your undergrad degree?
In the first time that I went in my undergraduate degree to Miami, Florida, I graduated from high school a year early, so I was young, right? And I turned 18 in that first October that I was there. I didn't have a sense of self. So I wasn't quite sure what Jamison Walker's plan was. I just kind of like threw the eggs out the window, and where they splatted, right? and I didn't know a lot of things about music. I didn't know anything about classical music. I couldn't have told you, other than Pavarotti, Domingo, and Carreras, and only that way, because I'd seen the Three Tenors concert on PBS, right? I couldn't have told you who some of the great singers were. So the weaknesses that I suffered were just a lack of knowledge, lack of understanding of the repertoire. I did not know that the Schubert song An die Musik existed until I was probably 2 years into my undergraduate, right? And it wasn't that I wasn't interested. I was interested. I wanted to know about these things. There weren't people who were talking about these things with us. It wasn't that they didn't care. They just had a different agenda.
Yeah,
And then,
I think sometimes with classical music, it moves very quickly into nobody knows, and then the next step is you're just expected to know. So that, yeah.
And the thing is with voice, anyways, I'm not sure because I don't play another instrument. With voice, I know that when I play the piano poorly, right, that when I'm doing that C major scale, that I have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have fingerings for those, right? But tell me the fingering for a B flat on an E vowel in the middle of a tenor's voice. There is no fingering for it. There's no guide map for us. Everything that we're dealing with is an intrinsic muscle, right? I can, if I'm lifting weights and I want to add a little more peak to my bicep, as I'm doing those bicep curls, I twist the wrist outward, right? And that peaks the tip, and I can watch that muscular thing happen. But when I'm talking to a tenor about going through the secondo passaggio and the dampening that needs to happen and the narrowing, and as Pavarotti puts it, the squeezing that happens in that portion of the voice, I cannot demonstrate for that physically. They can hear it orally. They can hear my representation of me doing that action, but that isn't going to teach them what the musculature feels like. And so coming from a school early in undergraduate and not having any idea what your cricothyroid, the cricoarytenoids, the crico, all those things, I had no idea what these things were. I didn't know what a poggio was. I didn't know how the diaphragm functioned. I didn't know how the rectus abdominis and the obliques and the epigastrum and all of these other things worked. And so it was always like hit or miss, right?
Okay.
Day one, I'd be able to sing fantastically well. And my teacher would be like, do it just like that. Well, then I wake up the next day and I have no idea what I did to do that. And there was no way for me to consistently practice it. One of the things that we do, that I do, and I know our colleagues at James Madison do, is that we make sure that there's an understanding of the process behind it and not trying to reproduce a sound, but instead to reproduce a process.
Okay.
And so that was one thing that I was definitely missing, was just misunderstanding of what myself was, what my instrument was, how that instrument functioned. And add into that, I had some really great friends, but I had some doozies of people who were awfully nasty. I don't want to use that word, but that's the best one. I remember the first time I sang the Mozart Requiem, a couple of people who were supposed to be my friends, they were my colleagues. First time I'd ever sung with orchestra, and they came to me and they're like, "Oh, were you singing? Because we couldn't hear you over the orchestra." Now, I got to hear the recording. You could hear me just fine. But it was just that kind of nastiness, and not being just a dumb kid, I didn't know how to deal with that kind of negativity. I didn't have enough sense of self.
Is there advice that you hear yourself saying to your students all the time?
Yeah. You have a voice and you have something to say. I know that sounds kind of trite, but no instrument is perfect. Every single singer that I've ever heard, or even if we talk about violinists or cellists, I mean, I'm sure that there are days that Yo-Yo Ma felt like he wasn't going to make it, right? Or that his interpretation of this particular piece was not what it needed to be. The difference is that those guys did whatever it took, right? They found the right mechanism that made their voice and what they have to say coherent. So often, I think singers think they need to be the next Pavarotti, or they need to be the next Renee Fleming. But but I want them to be the next them, right? Because no photograph of a person ever captures a person. No copy of a person is ever going to be as good as the original. And yet we're often told that we need to look a certain way, sound a certain way, act a certain way, and that just doesn't reap success. That doesn't, even if I'm able to, Jamison Walker, be a fabulous Pavarotti impersonator, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sound like him, talk like him, walk like him. I don't want to look like him. But if I were able to do that, it still would appear disingenuous to an audience because it's not the real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So to find their voice, to love it for where it is right now in the process, because it is indeed singular,
mm-hmm.
and to recognize that they have something to say and the world probably needs to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really great reason to pursue finding your voice.
Yeah. You've had a lot of, I guess, twists and turns in your career and your life. Is there something that you would define those detour moments as?
Well, yeah. Many of them grew me into the person that I am.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them shored up the knowledge that I do not want to do whatever that other thing was, that what I'm doing right now is what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it really shored that up for me, right?
Yeah.
It's acted at not doing basic training. I've done basic training in the Army twice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not doing basic training again is a huge motivator for me. I don't want to do that again. I want to be that uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But each of the things that happen to us, they build character, right?
Mm-hmm.
None of us develop muscles by sitting on the couch, right? Mm-hmm. None of us develop muscles by not putting those muscles under strain. And they break down a little bit and they get worn down. But when they regrow through proper nutrients and rest, when they grow back, they're stronger, they're bigger, right? And so all of those twists and turns and the horrible things in life, even the things that don't have a musical bearing on me, have all been things that have led to the right kind of emotional and personal and spiritual growth that have enabled me to handle the things that are happening now. So even though some of them are awful, and I wish that at the time that I could have bypassed those moments, the recognition that I have now of the strength that those things gave me then, that I developed then, help me as twists and turns come my way now, because they still come. You don't become a professor and suddenly the twists and turns go away, right? It's never going to end. There's always going to be a twist and a turn. I had like the perfect year this year, right? I had all kinds of things lined up professionally. I had all kinds of successes happening with my students. My studio here is great. I love my colleagues. School's going great. And then we have a worldwide pandemic. And I have 6 major gigs canceled and all of these. So twists and turns are just going to come, right? But having gone through them at times where the stakes were lower, and now when the stakes are higher, I'm able to endure those things. And even from an artistic point of view, it's hard to sing about love if you've never been in love. It's hard to sing about pain if you've never experienced pain, right? If you've not had your heart ripped out of your chest, it's really hard for you to organically convey having your heart ripped out of your chest on stage. It just won't seem authentic.
Yeah. Awesome. Can you maybe talk about what brought you to your position at JMU?
Sure. I loved my teaching job at Stetson University. My colleagues there are still my friends to this day. The university was moving in a direction that I didn't quite see myself long-term doing. And like I said, I got that really great job in China, so I took that job. But when I came back from China after a year and I wanted to be in academia again, I applied at several places. I got interviews in person at several places, and I was offered several positions. And I chose James Madison. And I'll tell you, it was a special moment. My day that I auditioned was a snow day. They canceled school, right? And so there was all this weird stuff. Jeff Bush, who was the former director, picked me up at my hotel room. We were literally sliding on the ice through stoplights and through stop signs sometimes too. It was really fun, but it was just a fantastic experience for me.
Good.
And so I chose JMU because this was the place that I wanted to be. I loved the colleagues that I have here, right? I love them. They're great people, and they're good people too. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Other places that I've applied, both before I went to Stetson and not, they had faculties that were sick in a way, right? They were having a hard time adjusting to either bad administration or long-term collegial disputes and stuff, and I didn't want to be part of that. And so here at James Madison, now as far as getting back into academia, I love teaching voice. I love it. I absolutely love it. I love the aha moment. I like the first time that my singer makes that sound that blows their mind, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, that came out of me." I love that moment.
Yeah.
I like teaching, and I like figuring it out. I don't adhere to the philosophy of my way or the highway, or one size fits all, or there is one path that leads to heaven. I think that there are myriad paths and myriad ways that we get to the places that we want to be. And I try to be for my students here, and well, any place that I teach, I try to be for them what I wish that I had when I was at their place, right?
Yeah.
I wish that I had somebody who said, "Hey, have you thought about this?" Helping them decide what success looks like. I mean, what does success look like, right? I feel very successful in what I do. But for some people, being a teacher at a liberal arts state school in the middle of Virginia is not necessarily success, right? They might think that I have a dear friend, Russell Thomas. He's a world famous tenor, and he's sung on every single stage on the world. I mean, the Met and La Scala and Covent Garden and Deutsche Oper Berlin and all of these great places. That was success for him, right? Now he's just been invited onto faculty at IU. That too is success for him, right? But for me, success is different. And helping our students find what success means, I think is paramount to them going out with a good plan.
Yep.
If your plan is, I'm going to be a vocal performance major, and by the time I graduate, I'm going to win the Met competition, and then I'm going to go do a fest contract in Germany for a year, and then I'm going to make my Met debut. I hate to tell you, that's a great plan, but you probably need to elongate that plan over the course of many years. It takes a hot minute to get there, right?
Yeah.
So, helping my students become what it is that they want to be by them setting their goals and not telling them what they're supposed to see, but telling them where to look and then letting them see what they see. I think that's important.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's part of the main goals of this podcast, is because although I've had great influences on my life going into graduation, I was kind of seeing like the perfect path, and I'm like, well, what if I don't do that? Like, am I just bound to fail? So with talking with everyone, that's really shown me and the people listening that, even our professors who we think have these perfect lives have done different things, and it's all worked out for them. And it's been great to hear different people's stories, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. Ultimately, I mean, whether you believe that there is a God or the great universe or the white buffalo or whatever it is that you ascribe to in life, we're here as spiritual beings having a human experience, right? And so music is one of those things. It's one of the few things that really can touch the spirit of a person. I mean, we'll hear a song, right? And we're immediately taken back to a time. Right? There are certain songs that I hear that take me right back to 1992, 1993 high school, right? And getting my heart ripped out. Or there are certain songs that take me right back to being in Miami, living on my own and trying for the very first time to figure out how I was going to balance a budget by working 3 jobs and going to school at the same time. There are all of these things that they're memories for me, and music does that for us. And so they're really, I mean, depending on what you see success as and how realistic your personal view of success is, and how comfortable you are with the vicissitudes of your life, meaning the things that you don't handle with as much grace as you should, and the things you really do handle well, right? Success can be a daily thing. Sometimes success is just putting the time in the practice room, even though the scale isn't perfect, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes success is getting out of the practice room and the first time that phrase makes sense to you, right?
Yeah.
So it's realizing that, I think, that our job as academics are, I mean, we hold certain things in. We want to make sure that when a singer leaves that they know who Schubert and Schumann and Wolf, and, you know, probably should know who Wagner and Puccini, Mozart for sure, right? If you're a pianist, you probably should know some of that rep, right? But outside of that, making sure that you have an understanding of the basics of what it is that we do, the rest of it is creative you. The rest of it is just you finding your voice and then speaking your truth.
Yeah. Wow.
Leonard Bernstein's, to achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. Boy, if necessity isn't truly the impetus for being able to get something done, right? I have felt that way so often. In fact, when I got here I have in the last probably 5 or 6 years sung most of the larger repertoire in the tenor stuff. So I do a lot of Strauss. I do a fair amount of Wagner, Mahler, stuff like that. The things that are a little, I mean, I don't call myself, I'm a Helden tenor, or I'm a dramatic tenor, or I'm a lyric tenor. I'm just a tenor because I can really sing it all. And I've worked really hard to, right? But I remember I got a call from Professor McMillan, and he's like, "Hey, do you know the Bach Magnificat?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I sang it like a decade, maybe 12 years ago." And he's like, "Okay, you're going to get a call in just a minute from somebody. They need you to fill in." I was like, "Oh, okay." So he hung up, I hung up. Like 30 seconds later, I got a call, and they're like, "Hey, do you know the Bach Magnificat?" I said, "Sure." I've sung the Deposuit a couple times, but it's been a hot minute since I've done the duet with the alto. And they're like, "Well, are you willing to fill in last minute?" And I said, "Sure." When is the performance? And they said, "In 2 hours in Charlottesville." It's an hour from my house, right? So I literally, my tuxedo was in the cleaner. So I put on a black suit, and he's like, "Can you put on a bow tie?" I said, "I don't even have any of my stuff. It's all in the cleaners." And so I literally came in, and my first dress rehearsal was the first performance. And then I had a chance to work with the mezzo just a little bit. He was actually countertenor, but then we worked for a little bit in between. So my actual second performance was the first time that I had sung it, not reading through it for the first time in a decade. So yeah, but it went really well. And because of that, I've been employed like 3 or 4 more times by similar companies to do other last minute things. At Duke University, last minute, their tenor soloist bowed out for the St. John's Passion by Bach. And so here, this music that I haven't sung in for forever, I find myself cramming in with not quite enough time. And yet that always seems to, the heightened energy and the anxiety and all that stuff seems to make it so much more exciting and fulfilling sometimes than everything going according to plan.
Yes, definitely.
I like the Franz Schubert one. When I wished to sing of love, it turned to sorrow. And when I wished to sing of sorrow, it transformed for me into love, right? I think that for singers, and I would imagine that it would be this way for all great instrumentalists, but I think that there has to be sorrow in the heart. I think that we have to have felt all of those emotions. And I think, actually, I'm sure that we've all been to performances where someone was singing and you can tell that they felt that you were blessed to just be there and listen to their beautiful voice. And it probably didn't do much for you. I know I've been to a few of those in my life, major artists sometimes, that I was so excited to hear. And then when I went and saw them, I was thoroughly underwhelmed by the emotional presence of that person. And, but when I love, there's a quote, and I'm going to butcher it because it came from a master class that I watched a colleague of mine do with a great coach. But they said the singer is something that's so different. It doesn't matter really if the singer's a good singer or a bad singer, but if they get something in their heart and they're willing to open that up and share, you'll weep with them regardless of the quality of their tone. And it's so true. When you think about Schubert and think about how beautiful, I mean, he was the ultimate melody writer, right? Even when you're singing of the love songs, there's a longing for it. And a lot of times in my own personal search for finding my inner chi and my peace and all that stuff, I found that the times that I was the most unhappy were the times that I was bucking against what reality was with what I thought reality should be at that time, right? And so when we are singing about love or when we're singing about sorrow, I don't think that we can have one without the other.
Yeah.
I think that to feel love is to have felt a degree of sorrow. And I think to feel true sorrow, we had to have first felt love.
Yeah, definitely.
I guess never give up, right? I know that sounds so trite, but I really do believe that every person has something to say. And I think that there's someone in the world who needs to hear it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to change the face of opera the way that Pavarotti did. I don't know that we'll have someone like that again, right? I think we were blessed to live at a time when we had access to someone like that and plenty of video and audio recording to go with it. But oftentimes the greatest changes that happen are the things that happen within the artists themselves or within the people who open themselves up to the artistic experience. And you may walk away from a concert and some little old lady or some young man might just thank you with a glimmer in their eye, and you have no idea but how you changed the world for them. And I think that remembering that, I tell my students, and this, I don't want to go off on a tangent and take too much time, but I tell my students that there are lots of things that are going on when we sing. There's what the poet wanted us to feel, right? And then that poet is viewing reality through his lens. And then the composer comes along and he adds another lens to that, right? And he, for whatever reason, chooses to write the notes that accompany that particular poem in the way that he does, with the accompaniment that comes with that, or the orchestration, or whatever. And so he's adding his own view of another person's view of reality. And then the singer comes along and they add their lens to it as well, right? And then when we put that out there into the world, it's viewed one more time through the lens of the observer and the person who's listening or feeling. And the crazy thing about it is that each one of them is true, even if each one of them is absolutely different, right? What made that poet say what they said, and what made that composer write and inspired to write what they wrote, and then the singer to sing it in the way that they sang it, and then the hearer to hear it in the way that they heard it. That's what makes us so great.
Yeah.
That's why people still go to live theater, because they want to feel, and they want to be able to find that space where they can recreate themselves.
Yeah, it's given me a lot to think about. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
It is my pleasure.
Before this interview, I had never really spoken with Dr. Walker, and I'm so glad that I had decided to interview him, because now I know he is no stranger to detours, and he really gave a lot of great perspective and a lot of guidance on how to handle life's ups and downs and remain positive through it all. Thank you for listening. You can keep up with the podcast on the Detours in Music podcast YouTube channel, Instagram account, and then on Apple Music podcast apps and Spotify. On the first of every month, we announce new episodes, and you can subscribe to the podcast on those apps, as well as my website, laurarupelobo.weebly.com, where I have a page of all the archived podcast episodes. Hope you enjoyed listening to this episode, and we will have new podcasts coming out very soon. Thanks.